Chapter 1. The chimes at Duscomsworth was the kind of village that seemed pulled from the pages of a postcard. Neatly trimmed hedgerows, lace-curtained windows, and cottages with names like Lavender Rise and Primrose Cottage etched on wooden. Signs that swayed gently in the breeze. Life here was steady and slow, like the rhythm of the church bells that chimed every Sunday morning and again on Wednesday evenings when the bell ringers gathered for the rehearsals. It was on one such evening that the quiet unraveling of Elmsworth began. The village's square was unusually lively for a Wednesday. The weekly Women's Guild meeting had just ended in the parish hall, and the scent of Earl Grey and shortbread still lingered in the air. Outside, villagers lingered, chatting in little knots beneath the flickering gas lamps, their coats drawn tight against the early October chill. The sky was low and gray, the kind of twilight that hinted rain, but promised none. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly on a wooden bench outside the hall, was buttoning her gloves with patient care. She had attended the Guild's discussion on modern embroidery techniques, and though she had contributed little, she had listened with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her hearing, though never boasted of, was far sharper than anyone suspected. From the direction of St. Sed's Church, the first practice bell sounded a low, resonant hum that drifted over the rooftops. Then another, and another. And then silence pause. Too long a pause. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Something about the silence did not sit right. Funny, said Mrs. Beatrice Hopley, bustling by with her wicker basket. They always go for at least 20 minutes. Maybe that new boy? What's his name, Edward? Maybe he's mucked it up again. Someone chuckled. Or maybe the old bell tower finally gave in and fell over. But Miss Marple didn't smile. She rose slowly, her pale blue scarf fluttering against her coat. From the churchyard, a figure came running. It was Thomas Bell, the vicar's gardener, and sometimes bell ringer. His face was pale, eyes wide. He didn't shout, but the way he moved rushed, but stunned caught attention. People turned. Quiet fell. Something's wrong, he gasped, breathless, stopping in the square. Mr. Weatherby's gone. Just gone. There was a ripple through the gathering. Gone? Said Mrs. Hopley. You mean he left early? No, said Thomas, shaking his head, mud streaked on his knees. He was there, just a moment ago. I saw him. I went to fetch the spare rope from the storeroom, and when I came back, he wasn't at his bell. You think he just walked off? Someone offered, unhelpfully. No, said Thomas again, softer now. There's blood. Just a little on the stone floor. Silence swallowed the square. Miss Marple stood quite still, her eyes narrowing. Slightly, not in fear, not in panic, but in thought. Mr. Weatherby doesn't strike me as the type to vanish, she said quietly, almost to herself. No one noticed. Already people were hurrying toward the church, but Miss Marple stayed behind for just a moment, watching the square as it emptied, watching the windows where curtains twitched and figures watched. Something had just shifted in Elmsworth. The bell had rung, and someone had silenced it. Chapter 2. The Bell Tower Mystery. By the time Miss Marple arrived at St. Sed's Church, a small crowd had already gathered outside the bell tower. The wooden door to the narrow spiral staircase stood ajar, casting a crooked shadow on the old stone path. A constable, young and breathless, clearly fetched in haste from the village constabulary, was awkwardly attempting to hold back the villagers. Please, everyone stay back, he said, adjusting his cap. This is a potential crime scene. We don't want footprints or disturbances. Footprints, Miss Marple noted silently, would have already been trampled a dozen times by now. She moved closer, quietly, as the crowd muttered among themselves. At the heart of the whispering was Mr. Arthur Weatherby, or rather the absence of him. Arthur had been the chief bell ringer of Elmsworth for nearly 30 years. A stout man in his early 60s with a fondness for boiled sweets and an unmatched punctuality. Arthur had never missed a rehearsal or a Sunday service, not even when he broke his ankle falling from his bicycle 2 winters ago. He was reliable, steady, and as far as Miss Marple had ever observed, rather dull, which made his sudden disappearance all the more troubling. Inside the tower, the air was musty and still. The ropes hung limp from the ceiling, and the bells above were silent as stone. On the cold floor near the third bell rope, a smear of something dark marred the gray stone blood. Not much, just enough to suggest injury, but not enough to explain a disappearance. Slipped and hit his head, most likely, muttered Dr. Bramley, the local physician, as he stood over the mark. Could have wandered off in a daze. Concussion does strange things. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, who had quietly joined them inside. She examined the room with careful eyes that had seen much over the years. Her gaze passed over the rough stone walls, the rope ends, the wooden pegs on the wall where ringers hung their coats. One peg was empty. His coat's gone, she said aloud. Dr. Bramley frowned. Odd, he wouldn't have taken it if he were injured. The constable was already taking notes, slowly and with spelling errors. From above came the sound of footsteps. Thomas Bell, having ascended the spiral stairs to the bell chamber. There's nothing up here, Thomas called down. No sign of him, just the ropes and... Wait, a pause. Then he came back down, a confused expression on his face. What is it? Miss Marple asked gently. Thomas held something in his hand. It was a small metal object, thin, slightly bent. Tuning fork, he said. It was wedged under the edge of the bell stand. Doesn't belong to us. Dr. Bramley raised an eyebrow. What would a tuning fork be doing up there? Miss Marple took it delicately. It was scratched, old, and stamped with a faint maker's mark. E.H. 1913. Her brow furrowed. A strange thing to leave behind. She murmured. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the ivy that climbed the stone tower. Someone coughed nervously in the crowd. The whispers were growing louder. Vanished. Blood. An old man. And now a tuning fork? I'll send men to search the village, the constable said. If he's concussed or injured, he may be wandering about somewhere. But Miss Marple was no longer looking at the bell tower or the constable. Her gaze had drifted toward the vicarage next door, where a light flickered in an upper window. Inside, someone had just pulled back the curtain and then let it fall shut. Not the vicar. He was standing nearby, wrapped in his robes. Someone else. She tucked the tuning fork into her handbag and stepped back. Elmsworth is not a place for vanishing, she said softly. Not without someone noticing. And Miss Marple always noticed. Chapter 3. Whispers at the vicarage. The next morning dawned gray and damp, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. In Elmsworth, a village that typically started its day with slow, sleepy routine, the streets stirred earlier than usual. Windows opened. Neighbors exchanged speculation over garden walls. At the post office, whispers buzzed faster than the sorting machine. Mr. Weatherby was still missing. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible overcoat, made her way toward the vicarage just after 9:30. It was a deliberate choice, not too early to be rude, not too late to miss the morning tea. Her eyes, though soft and inquisitive, missed nothing. The muddy footprints near the gate, 2 different sets. The vicar's bicycle unusually absent. From its usual resting place by the holly bush, the faint scent of burning paper from the chimney, despite it being far too mild for a fire. She was met at the door by Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher, the vicar's new housekeeper. A tall, nervy woman in her 40s with reddish hair and a complexion prone to blotching when flustered. Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting well. Do come in. We've all been so dreadfully upset since last night. Yes, such a shock, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. I thought perhaps I might drop in on the Reverend. He must be terribly busy with all the concern about poor Mr. Weatherby. Mrs. Fletcher nodded rapidly, then hesitated. The vicar's in his study. He's composing a statement for the bishop, I believe, but I'll let him know you're here. As the woman turned down the hall, Miss Marple stood still for a moment. The vicarage was unusually tidy, sterile, even. Not the usual faint smell of furniture polish and ink, but rather a sharp tongue of something more acidic. Disinfectant, perhaps. Her nose twitched, and then she noticed it. On the small table in the hallway sat a music book, Campanology, the art and science of bell ringing, open to a chapter titled Resonance and Harmonic Interference. A small bookmark had been wedged inside, a newspaper clipping about tonal vibrations and sound frequencies in church towers. Curious reading for a man of the cloth. Miss Marple barely had time to tuck that detail away before the vicar appeared. Miss Marple, he said warmly, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested a poor night's sleep. I must admit you are more punctual than the Morning Post. I do try, she smiled. I won't stay long. Just thought I might offer a friendly ear. These things do unsettle a community. The vicar sighed, guiding her into the sitting room. Unsettle is too gentle a word, I'm afraid. I've had 3 parishioners call me this morning, demanding I exorcise the bell tower. And old Mr. Linton, he's convinced it's the ghost of a monk who fell from the spire in 1623. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. And what do you think happened? The vicar's smile faltered for half a beat. I think ... Mr. Weatherby had an accident, possibly wandered off. We mustn't let our imaginations run wild. No, of course not, she said gently, her gaze never leaving his face. Though I always say, imagination fills in what conscience refuses to see. A pause. Before the vicar could respond, a sharp clattering sounded from the kitchen. Miss Marple glanced over. Oh dear, said the vicar, already rising. Mrs. Fletcher's nerves have been dreadfully frayed. But Miss Marple was already rising too. No need to fuss. I should be going. I just wanted to say, if there's anything at all you recall, anything Mr. Weatherby might have said or done that seemed unusual, do let me know. He hesitated, actually. He said slowly, now that you mention it. He did seem distracted the past few weeks. Came to confession twice, which was unlike him. But of course, I couldn't possibly. No, I wouldn't dream of asking, said Miss Marple already. Halfway to the door. Though sometimes it's what people don't say that speaks loudest. She left him standing there, her footsteps quiet as she stepped back onto the gravel path. She glanced once more at the vicarage window where a light had flickered last night. Someone had watched the bell tower before Mr. Weatherby vanished. And someone she suspected had something to hide. Chapter 4. The man with the quiet shoes. It was just afternoon when Miss Marple took her usual walk toward the high street, umbrella in hand, despite the clear sky. She was not, in fact, expecting rain. She carried it because people noticed an umbrella. And when people noticed one thing, they often said another, without realizing they'd revealed far more. At the corner where the baker met the greengrocer, she paused to greet Mr. Percy Hodges, the postmaster. Terrible business about Arthur Weatherby, he said, barely waiting for pleasantries. 1 minute ringing bells, next minute poof. People don't just go poof, Mr. Hodges. Miss Marple replied mildly. Even if they wish to. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. They say the new man, the lodger at the Coachman's Arms, was asking about the bell tower last week. Odd fellow. Foreign shoes. Miss Marple blinked. Foreign shoes? Oh, yes, said Mr. Hodges. Rubber soles. Silent as anything. I saw him pass twice without hearing a step. Ah, she smiled, tucking that away. And what's his name? This quiet-footed gentleman. Mr. Lyle. Claims to be writing a book, but no one's seen a notebook in his hand, let alone a typewriter. With thanks and a brief nod, Miss Marple continued down the lane. The coachman's arms stood at the village edge, an old coaching inn turned modest lodging house, with ivy creeping up its outer wall like long green fingers. Inside, the innkeeper, Mrs. Gudgeon, seemed all too pleased to gossip. "Mr. Lyle?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Strangest tenant I've had in years. Keeps to himself mostly. Goes out late. Sleeps odd hours." "And does he know Mr. Weatherby?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Oh, no. He barely speaks to anyone. Says he's writing some academic thing, something about sound waves or physics. Rents the end room upstairs. You can hear the floor creak when he paces, which he does quite a lot." Miss Marple, politely refusing tea, made her way upstairs as Mrs. Gudgeon called out the man's name. No reply. Knocking gently, she pressed her ear to the door. Silence. Then a faint shuffling. Finally, the door opened. Mr. Lyle stood there, a pale, thin man in his 30s, with spectacles and a nervous manner. "Yes?" he asked, blinking at her. "I'm so sorry to intrude," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I was just inquiring after poor Mr. Weatherby. You see, I've made a habit of noticing things that don't quite fit, and you seem rather new." Lyle's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "I'm not involved in anything, if that's what you're implying." "Of course not, dear," she said gently. "Only I've always found that those who deny involvement before being asked often know more than they think." He hesitated. "I study resonance, acoustics. I asked about the bell tower because churches have unique harmonic structures. I quite understand. Music and murder do share space in the strangest of places." His eyes flicked toward his desk. Miss Marple followed them and noticed a curious object. Another tuning fork, nearly identical to the one found in the tower. Before she could speak again, he said quickly, "I didn't kill him." She raised her eyebrows. "I didn't say you did, Mr. Lyle." But now she knew something. He had been in the bell tower, and he had a reason for being silent. Chapter 5. The sound that shouldn't echo later that evening. A thin drizzle began to fall over Elmsworth, pattering softly against the windows of Primrose Cottage, Miss Marple's home. The fireplace crackled gently in the sitting room, and the scent of lavender polish lingered in the air. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, not to write, but to think. 5 pieces of information lay before her. Figuratively speaking, Mr. Weatherby, long trusted and reliable, had vanished during a bell-ringing rehearsal. A small smear of blood had been found beneath his usual rope. A tuning fork, dated and worn, had been discovered near the bells. The vicar's housekeeper had reacted oddly to a simple visit, and now a peculiar man named Mr. Lyle was staying in the village under the guise of research, with a near-identical tuning fork in his room. Coincidences? Perhaps. But in Miss Marple's long life, true coincidences were as rare as a summer without gossip. She stood and crossed the room to a cabinet, where she kept a collection of old parish newsletters and personal clippings. Some had been given to her. Others she'd inherited in her own way over the years. Within a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, a 10-year-old bulletin from St. Sed's. There, on page 4, Mr. Weatherby and local youth James Marchford repair bell housing. James Marchford, a name not heard in years. He'd been a clever boy with a restless energy and a fascination with sound. Miss Marple remembered him once trying to build a contraption that could make a wine glass sing. His parents had sent him to a technical college in Oxford. He hadn't been seen since, until perhaps now. Could it be? Just then there came a knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Crisp, rain-speckled and frowning. He removed his hat politely. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm afraid I've come with troubling news. They found something behind the church near the old gardener's shed." She stepped aside. "Do come in, Inspector." Inside, he shook off his coat, lowering his voice. Some local boys were kicking a ball in the churchyard and noticed something strange footprints near the far wall. Old ones, muddied, led to a patch of disturbed earth behind the shed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Shall I assume what they found buried there was not a tool bag?" He nodded grimly. "A body. Not fully buried. Head trauma, likely recent. We haven't confirmed identity yet, but it's Mr. Weatherby." Crisp hesitated, then nodded again. "I don't understand it, Miss Marple," he said almost helplessly. "No enemies. No motive. Who kills an old bell ringer and hides him like a sack of potatoes? Someone who didn't want him to hear. Something, she said softly. Or perhaps someone he already did hear. There was a pause. She added, "I believe your killer is not only clever, Inspector, but precise. Very precise. He understands sound, vibrations, acoustics." Crisp frowned. Like a musician? Like an engineer? Or a physicist? Or someone trained in both? The inspector blinked. "You think this Mr. Lyle?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that the sound of a bell is meant to echo. But Mr. Weatherby may have heard something that shouldn't have echoed at all." Chapter 6. Secrets in the Stone. The next morning brought no peace to Elmsworth. News of the discovery behind. The church had spread like fire on dry grass. Mr. Weatherby's death confirmed by inspector. Crisp at the village green stunned even those most prone to suspicion. A man like Arthur Weatherby didn't simply get murdered. Not in Elmsworth, but he had got Miss Marple. Meanwhile, walked once again to St. Sed's, her pace steady, her eyes alert. She was met at the church steps by Thomas Bell, the young ringer who had first raised the alarm. He looked pale. "I keep thinking," he said as she approached, "what if I hadn't gone to fetch the rope? I'd have been there. I might have seen who did it, or been the next victim," Miss Marple replied gently. "It was a matter of timing, Thomas. A moment later, and you'd have interrupted something very inconvenient for the killer." She glanced upward toward the tower. "I'd like to see it again, the bell chamber." He hesitated. "It's still locked. Police orders." "Would you walk me round the outside then?" "I want to see the stonework." He agreed, and they walked around to the back of the church where the gardener's shed crouched beneath the ivy, and the soil still showed signs of the shallow grave. That had held Mr. Weatherby. Miss Marple stopped beside the east wall. "There," she said suddenly, pointing. "Do you see that?" Thomas squinted. "The brick?" "One brick," she said, "is newer than the others. Lighter stone. No moss. And there's a hairline crack just above it." Thomas leaned in. "That's odd. The church hasn't been altered in years." "Precisely," she said. She tapped the stone with her umbrella. A hollow sound. Then she turned. "Tell me, Thomas, do you know what a sound trap is?" "A what?" "A cavity built within a structure to capture or direct sound used in theaters, some cathedrals, even military research." Thomas blinked. "Why would someone build one here?" "I don't believe someone built it. I believe someone discovered it, and someone else tried to cover it up." They stared at the wall for a moment longer. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the path behind the shed narrow, muddy and rarely used. Yet there were 2 sets of boot prints, nearly dried, faint but traceable. She bent slowly and examined the prints. One large, thick -OLAD, the other narrow rubber -SOLED silent. "I think," she said, "that Mr. Weatherby may have found something. Hidden in the church wall a cavity or mechanism. And I think someone knew he was getting too close. Thomas looked at her. But why? What could be inside a wall that's worth killing over? Miss Marple stood. Sound, Thomas, she said. And silence. And something or someone trying very hard to keep the past buried. She looked up at the church tower, as if listening for something. A bell rang out not from Elmsworth, but faint and distant from Marleycombe village miles away. A sound. Always travels, she said softly. Even secrets echo. Chapter 7. The confessional silence Inspector Crisp had never particularly liked churches. He respected them, of coarse-stained glass, solemn hymns, the smell of old wood polish, but stepping inside always gave him the impression he was being silently judged by a dozen unseen eyes. This morning was no exception, that he stood just inside. St. Sed's, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the confessional booth near the altar. He came here twice, he muttered, as Miss Marple joined him. Weatherby, the vicar said so. Yes, she said calmly. And that alone tells us he was frightened. Guilty, perhaps? Possibly. But guilt can take many forms, Inspector. Sometimes we feel it for discovering a truth we wish we hadn't. Crisp rubbed the back of his neck. It's a mess. No clear motive, no real suspect. And now you're telling me he may have found a secret cavity in the church wall. Not may have, Miss Marple corrected. Did. She led him toward the bell tower once more, retracing steps from the night before. The constables had unlocked it now, and the rope chamber smelled of damp dust and metal. The blood had been cleaned, but its memory lingered. Miss Marple pointed. Toward the wall behind the third bell rope. There. Look closely at the mortar line. He stepped in, narrowing his eyes. Thin, he muttered. Uneven. Almost looks as if it's been tampered with. She nodded. I believe there's a space behind that section. Perhaps even a tunnel or chamber. Something not on the original plans. And you think someone killed Weatherby because of it? No, said Miss Marple. I believe someone killed him because he recognized something or someone connected to it. Inspector Crisp turned sharply. You mean he found the cavity? And the person who knew about it? She tapped her umbrella lightly on the stone floor. Or perhaps, she said, he remembered a sound. A voice from long ago. They walked back toward the main aisle. Have you considered, she asked, who knew this church intimately as a child? Someone who might have hidden something years ago, then returned under a new name? Crisp stiffened. You're talking. About the Marchford boy. I believe so. James Marchford. Brilliant, restless, fascinated by acoustics. Left Elmsworth with unfinished secrets. And I believe he has returned. Crisp frowned. And you think he's Mr. Lyle? I do. I believe Mr. Lyle is not writing a book. I believe he's come back to recover something he left behind. Such as? That, she said, remains to be seen. But Mr. Weatherby must have remembered him, perhaps even recognized him in the bell tower. Maybe James confessed something. Long ago, something the vicar never forgot. And perhaps Weatherby, ever dutiful, confronted him. Then Lyle panicked. Crisp murmured, following the theory. Struck him. Hid the body behind the shed, thinking no one would look. Miss Marple turned toward the wooden booth by the altar of the confessional. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, if someone returned to hide something in the church, wouldn't the confessional be the safest place of all? Crisp stared. You think there's something hidden in there? I think, she said quietly, it's time we had a look. Chapter 8. What the vicar knew the confessional at St. Sed's Church was an old oak structure, darkened with age and dusted with the fine silt of centuries. It hadn't been used regularly. For decades modern villagers preferred there. Sins to be kept in whispers, not booths. But it stood nevertheless, as solid and secretive as a sealed vault. Inspector Crisp bent low, examining the base, while Miss Marple moved to the side, running her gloved hand along the carved paneling. The smell of candle wax, wood polish, and something faintly sour filled the space. "Anything?" Crisp asked. "Not yet," she murmured. "But this booth was built by hand, a century ago. And if someone wanted to conceal something small, they wouldn't need a new wall or cavity. They'd only need this." She pressed gently on the inner left panel. There was a soft click. A narrow slit opened a hidden compartment within the wood, no more than 6 inches deep and just as wide. Inside sat a small black velvet pouch. Crisp reached in and pulled it out. It felt oddly heavy for its size. He unfastened the drawstring and poured the contents onto the confessional seat. Out fell a set of keys, a small golden medallion, and a folded document, dry but intact. Miss Marple leaned in. Ah, not treasure, not gold, but something equally dangerous. Evidence. Crisp unfolded the paper, his brow furrowed. "It's a letter. Looks old, weathered." He read aloud. "To whomever finds this, the bell tower contains more than sound. The mechanism behind rope 3 leads to the catacomb chamber sealed. Since 1903, James helped me repair the bell housing, but he discovered the old passage. I told him it was dangerous. He wouldn't listen. He planned to return someday and reclaim what he left hidden. I fear what that might mean." A WCR ISP looked up. A.W. Arthur Weatherby. Miss Marple nodded. The inspector picked up the medallion next. It was engraved with a family crest 3 swords above a Latin motto, Silentio Vincimus. In silence we conquer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A private school emblem. Marchford's, the very one he attended after leaving Elmsworth. They both stood in silence. "He came back to retrieve what he hid," Crisp murmured, "and Weatherby tried to stop him. That letter? He must have written it days ago, in case something happened, and hidden it in the place no one would look," Miss Marple said, "except someone who listens." At that moment, the church door creaked open. They turned. The vicar stood there, white as the church linen. "You found it," he said softly. Crisp stiffened. "You knew about the passage." "I did," the vicar replied. "Arthur told me 10 years ago. I made him swear never to speak of it. It wasn't just dangerous, it was sacred. The chamber below was used to shelter dissenters during the Reformation. It was sealed for a reason. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "someone unsealed it, or tried to." The vicar looked down. "He came to me weeks ago. Not as Mr. Lyle. As James, I recognized him at once. He said he was researching, said he only wanted to retrieve a box he left there when he was a boy. But when I refused to grant access to the tower, he grew agitated. Then he turned to Weatherby," Crisp said grimly. The vicar nodded. "Arthur always had a soft heart. Too soft." Miss Marple's voice was very quiet now, and so James Marchford returned. "Not for treasure, but for secrets. Perhaps blackmail material. Perhaps something worse." Crisp straightened. "We need to find him. Now." Miss Marple didn't move. "No," she said. "You won't have to look far." Both men turned to her, startled. "I believe," she continued, "that Mr. Lyle James Marchford is still in the village. And if I'm right, he'll return to the church tonight." Chapter 9. Return to the Bells Night in Elmsworth settled like a hush after prayer. The village was unusually still. No dogs barked. No footsteps echoed on the cobbled square. Only the wind stirred, rustling ivy against ancient stone as clouds crawled across the moon. At St. Sed's, the church tower loomed against the dark sky, a sentinel watching over the sleeping village and waiting inside, hidden in the shadows near the vestry. Miss Marple sat silently in the second pew, wrapped in her gray shawl, hands folded, eyes on the bell rope chamber. Inspector Crisp waited just behind the altar, his boots muffled with soft cloth, revolver holstered but ready. They had not spoken in some time. Their plan was simple. Wait, because if James Marchford alias Mr. Lyle had indeed returned to Elmsworth to retrieve something from the hidden catacomb chamber, now that Weatherby was out of the way, he would come back tonight. He had no other choice. The village was already stirring with suspicion, and it would not be long before his false name, UNRAVELLED, at precisely 12:37 a.m. The side door creaked open. Miss Marple didn't move. A figure slipped inside, wrapped in a dark coat, glancing left and right. He carried a lantern, old-fashioned, oil-burning, like those still found in church basements. The light flickered over the pews as he advanced, slowly toward the bell tower chamber. He didn't notice the still shape near the vestry, nor the shadow behind the altar. James Marchford looked older than his years now haunted. The calm academic persona had dropped. His hands shook as he reached into his coat and pulled out a key, one of the ones from the velvet pouch. He fitted into the panel behind the third bell rope and twisted. There was a click. A section of the wall shifted outward, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Crisp stepped out just then, revolver drawn. "Going somewhere, Mr. Marchford?" The man froze. Miss Marple rose as well, gently, like a figure in a dream. James's eyes darted wildly. "I didn't kill him," he said, breath quickening. "I swear I didn't mean to. He fell. He slipped." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He didn't. You struck him. Because he threatened to report you. Because he recognized you." James's voice cracked. "I had to get it back. It's mine. I built it, hid it there, years ago. A sound device. I was only 16, but it worked. It could vibrate at a frequency that disorients the brain. It was never meant to hurt anyone, just a theory. A theory that became obsession," she said. "And when Weatherby got too close..." James took a step backward toward the open passage. Crisp advanced. "Don't." But James suddenly turned and bolted down the stone stairs. "Inspector," Miss Marple warned. Crisp gave chase, disappearing into the hidden passage beneath the church. The bell tower swallowed them both. In echoing silence, Miss Marple, breathing steadily, stepped to the top of the stairs, gripping her umbrella. She would not follow into the dark. Instead, she waited. Moments later, the echo of a scuffle. A cry, the sound of something metallic clattering on stone. Then footsteps returning. Crisp emerged, out of breath, gripping James Marchford by the collar. "He tried to destroy it," he said. "That machine. The one he hid there. It's real. Wires, crystals, some strange acoustic mechanism. God knows what he was planning." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Elmsworth isn't made for secrets," she said, "especially not ones that hum below the stone and ring through the bones of a church." James said nothing. His eyes were empty. Crisp led him away, through the church's front doors and into the night. Alone once more, Miss Marple turned. The bell tower. The ropes hung motionless. And for the first time in days, she could almost hear them ring. Chapter 10. The echo after midnight, following morning, brought a strange kind of quiet to Elmsworth. Not the soft quiet of routine or the gentle hush of village life, but something else, like a pause between notes in a song that everyone knew but no longer wanted to sing. Word had spread that Mr. Lyle, now unmasked as James Marchford, had been taken into custody. There were whispers, of course, wild and half-formed. Secret rooms beneath the church, ancient machines that could drive a man mad, even talk of haunted frequencies. But in the face of mystery, Helmsworth did what it always did best. It went on. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to move on too quickly. She sat once again in a rose-print armchair at Primrose Cottage, reading the final police statement. Inspector Crisp had dropped off himself not an hour earlier. Subject detained after fleeing scene. Confessed to constructing an experimental acoustic device in adolescence and hiding it beneath a church. Motive confirmed his attempt to recover said device before exposure. Arthur Weatherby discovered the truth and confronted him. Subject admits to striking Weatherby in panic during the confrontation. It was, in the inspector's words, an open and shut case. And yet, Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the newspaper, clipping folded beside her tea. University researcher ousted in unethical experiment scandal. James Martford resigns. So it hadn't started in Elmsworth. It had simply ended here. She folded the paper away. The true horror, she thought, wasn't the device. It wasn't even the murder. It was the delusion, the belief that a mind as brilliant as Marchford's could meddle with truth and memory and sound itself, and do so without consequence. And poor Mr. Weatherby, faithful, ordinary, unremarkable, had simply stood in the way. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Thomas Bell, hat in hand, his face unreadable. "I just wanted to say thank you, Miss Marple," he said softly, "for finding out the truth, for not letting it stay buried." She smiled gently. "Secrets are heavy things, Thomas. It's best they don't linger under floorboards or between bells." He hesitated, then said, "We'll ring them again this Sunday. For Mr. Weatherby, as a memorial." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, let the village hear them." Loud and clear. As he turned to go, the bells of St. Sed's struck noon clean and strong, their notes rippling across the rooftops, like a hymn returning home. Miss Marple closed the door. Some echoes fade, but others, especially those built from guilt, grief, and quiet murder, linger forever in the stone. Chapter 11. A stranger at the Lich Gate. 3 days had passed since James Marchford's arrest, and Elmsworth had begun to exhale. The bells rang again. The church pews filled on Sunday, if only to reassure the congregation that life and sound carried on. But beneath that comfort, a quiet curiosity lingered. What had been beneath the church all those years? No one asked Miss Marple directly. They never did. But the glances at the market, the sudden hush when she passed, the sideways nods at the post office, they all spoke the same language. "Tell us what we're too polite to ask." She told no one. Some truths, she believed, were better stored than shared. On the fourth morning, the mystery returned, not through bell towers or confessionals, but at the Lich Gate of St. Sed's. Miss Marple, walking back from the baker with a small brown loaf and a folded copy of the Times, noticed a stranger standing there, staring up at the church. He was tall, somewhere in his 50s, wearing a black overcoat and holding a walking stick he didn't seem to need. His face was thoughtful, lips slightly pursed. Not local. As she passed, he turned slightly. "Pardon me," he said in a low, smooth voice. "Is this the church involved in the unfortunate business last week?" She stopped. "Indeed," she replied, "though we try not to define it by tragedy alone." "Of course," he said with a faint smile. "I'm a lecturer in architectural acoustics. I'd read of the peculiar elements involved, hidden structures, resonant chambers. Fascinating, if unsettling." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And are you here professionally? Or personally?" He tilted his head. "Perhaps a bit of both." "A strange place to seek echoes, mister." He hesitated only for half a breath. "Dr. Alan Kershaw." Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave his face. "That's interesting," she said after a pause, "because Dr. Alan Kershaw wrote an article on sacred acoustics in 1938. I read it." But he passed away in 1952. I remember it well. It caused quite a stir at the symposium in Oxford. The man froze. Then slowly he smiled. "You're very sharp, Miss Marple." She nodded slightly. "And you're very bad at aliases." There was a silence between them now. Then the man tipped his imaginary hat. "Good day." He turned and walked away, not quickly, not nervously, just decisively. As if his purpose here was done. Miss Marple didn't follow. She merely watched him pass through the gate and vanish down the lane. Later, she would tell Inspector Crisp. The man was likely a colleague of Marchford's or a competitor. Someone who knew what had once been hidden beneath the church and wanted to know if it had been found. Perhaps it had. Perhaps it hadn't. But the real secret, Miss Marple knew, was not what had been hidden underground. It was who came looking for it, and what they were willing to do to keep it. And in Elmsworth, that echo had only just begun. Chapter 12. The bell that didn't ring the next Sunday. The entire village gathered at St. Sed's for a memorial service. In honor of Arthur Weatherby, the air was thick with incense and quiet grief. Even the pews seemed to bow slightly in reverence. The altar was dressed in white lily, and a framed photograph of Arthur squinting slightly in the sun, holding a teacup, sat beside the pulpit. Miss Marple arrived early, settling near the rear. She preferred to observe from behind. It was, she always said, where truth was most visible, on the backs of necks. The restless hands, the turned heads. As the service began, Thomas Bell stood at the tower ropes with a small team of ringers, ready to sound the first peal in Weatherby's memory. Miss Marple counted silently. First bell high and clear. Second slightly flat. Third resonant and long. Fourth sharp. Fifth nothing. A pause. A flutter among the congregation. Thomas looked puzzled. He tugged again. Still nothing. The vicar, standing at the pulpit, cleared his throat to cover the moment, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, because the fifth bell had rung 3 days ago. She had heard it herself. It wasn't broken then. After the service, she waited for Thomas near the base of the tower. "It won't sound," he said. Frustrated. "Rope's intact, but there's some kind of resistance. Like it's been jammed. May I?" She asked. Inside the rope chamber, the fifth rope hung at a slight angle, not slack, but tight in a way that suggested unnatural tension. Miss Marple followed the rope upward with her eyes, and then examined the base mechanism. And there, just visible at the point where the rope passed through the floorboard, was a thin strip of copper wire, almost imperceptible, looped tightly. A trap. Someone didn't want that bell to ring, she murmured. Thomas frowned. But why? Who would? She turned to him slowly. "Tell me, did Mr. Weatherby have a routine? A pattern for when he rang the bells alone?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, always the same order. 5 was his favorite." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "And perhaps 5 was the bell he was ringing when he died?" Thomas paled. "You think he was meant to pull it? That someone tampered with the mechanism?" "I think someone planned precisely for that moment, a vibration at just the right frequency. And when Weatherby pulled rope 5, it triggered something." She nodded. Double quotes, not just a sound. "Perhaps a release mechanism. Perhaps even a blow. Enough to knock him unconscious. Maybe kill him outright." Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. "But he didn't fall by accident." "No," said Miss Marple. "He was played like one of his bells." She stepped back, looking up. The tower, the mechanism still here. Damaged, perhaps. But the intent is clear. And as she walked out of the bell tower into the churchyard light, she felt the chill of a truth slowly sharpening. James Marchford hadn't acted alone. Chapter 13. The housekeeper's mistake that evening. Elmsworth was once again awash in murmurs. A booby-trapped bell. It sounded absurd, like something out of a serial novel. Yet those who knew Miss Marple knew better than to scoff. Her theories, however improbable, had a way of becoming unwelcome truths. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her parlor and opened her small black notebook. On one page she wrote 3 names: James Marchford Arthur Weatherby Eleanor Fletcher. Then she drew a neat question mark beside the last. She had not forgotten Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher, the nervous housekeeper with the trembling hands. During her visit to the vicarage, something had gnawed at her, something too subtle to grasp at the time. A smell? A sound? No, something visual. A detail that didn't fit. Now she remembered no dust. The study had been pristine. Not a speck on the mantel or bookshelves. But Miss Marple had seen that same room many times under the previous housekeeper, cluttered, gently chaotic, lived in. This new gleam, this almost clinical order. It was too recent, too deliberate. She returned to the vicarage the next morning. Mrs. Fletcher opened the door, surprised but polite. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect." "No one ever does," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "Might I pop in for a word? I was just speaking with the inspector about bell safety." Mrs. Fletcher tensed, just slightly. "Of course. The study's free." Miss Marple stepped in, eyes quietly scanning the hallway. On the study desk, a brass cloth lay folded beside a bottle of cleaner. She lifted it gently, as though inspecting. "A doily. Curious," she said. "Most housekeepers use beeswax or lemon oil, but this is industrial solvent." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flicked to it. "The vicar likes things spotless." "I'm sure," said Miss Marple, "especially when trying to remove fingerprints." The silence that followed was sharp. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. "You see, Eleanor, may I call you that? I found something unusual in the bell tower yesterday. A wire, very fine, wrapped where it didn't belong. And someone very clever wanted to ensure that one bell would trigger a deadly mechanism." Mrs. Fletcher said nothing, so I began to wonder, who has access to the church keys? Who cleaned the vicar's study before the police arrived? Who removed a tuning fork from that desk? Because yes, I know there was a second one. Still nothing. James Marchford may have returned to retrieve what he once hid, but he wasn't the only one who knew about it. Finally, the woman's lips moved. "He promised me it wouldn't go too far." Miss Marple remained still. "He told me," Mrs. Fletcher whispered, "it was just about the machine. The research. He needed a way in. He needed the vicarage. I was only meant to help him to the tower. Weatherby was never supposed to die." "You helped him install the trap," Miss Marple said gently. "You cleaned the mechanism, removed the evidence." Mrs. Fletcher lowered herself into the armchair as if her legs had gone. "I loved him once, years ago, before he left, before he changed." Miss Marple sighed, her voice low. "Love makes fools of us all, but murder makes liars." Outside, faintly, the bells of another church began to ring. This time, Miss Marple did not smile. Chapter 14. The Vicar's Dilemma. Later that day, Inspector Crisp sat at Miss Marple's kitchen table, staring grimly into his untouched cup of tea. The lace curtain behind him fluttered gently in the breeze, but his face remained as rigid as stone. "She confessed?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Miss Marple nodded. "Not in so many words. But guilt has a way of blooming in silence, doesn't it?" He exhaled slowly. "We knew Marchford had help. The rigging was too careful, too clean. But the vicarage? I didn't see that coming." "She gave him access," Miss Marple said. "Time, cover, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to believe he was justified." Crisp frowned. "You're saying she believed in him?" "I'm saying," she said gently, "that she remembered him. The boy he was. And in her loneliness, that memory felt safer than the man he became. He rubbed his temple. God help us. Just then the kettle whistled softly, and Miss Marple rose to pour fresh tea. As she did, the inspector added quietly, "The vicar's in a state. He didn't know anything, apparently. But having someone living in his home, helping with a murder." Miss Marple glanced out the window. He may not have known, but he suspected. Clergymen are not trained detectives, but they're fine students of the human soul. Later that evening, she walked once more to St. Sed's, her steps careful on the damp path. She found Reverend Hall alone in the chapel, sitting in the front pew, his robes folded beside him, his face pale with something heavier than grief. "You were right," he said before she could speak. "About Eleanor, about all of it. I hoped I wasn't," she replied gently. He looked up. "Do you believe in redemption, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "I believe in accountability. Redemption comes after." The vicar gave a hollow laugh. "She found him again, you know, James, about a year ago. She never told me they'd once been involved. Not properly. She only said she wanted to help a friend with a research grant. I thought it strange, but I've turned a blind eye before. Sometimes we clergy prefer not to confront what doesn't fit into prayer." Miss Marple sat beside him, hands folded. "She risked everything for him," he said. "She lost everything?" "For him," Miss Marple corrected. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the church still as stone. Then the vicar rose slowly. "What happens to the church now?" Miss Marple stood with him. "It continues, because the bells still ring, and because people still listen." Outside, dusk had settled over Elmsworth, washing the church in purple light. The wind had shifted. Rain was coming, but for now the village held its breath quiet, watchful waiting for the last echo to fade. Chapter 15. Beneath the stone. The following morning brought a break in the rain, and with it a quiet knock on Miss Marple's door. It was Inspector Crisp, coat damp, expression tight. "We've opened the chamber," he said simply. Miss Marple didn't need to ask which one. 10 minutes later, she stood beside him at the edge of the bell tower's hidden stair, lanterns glowing in the half-light, a constable stationed above. The once sealed entrance, now fully revealed, led downward into ancient stone. The air below was damp and metallic, thick with the smell of earth and rust. They descended slowly, step by step. At the bottom, a low-arched passage, perhaps 20 feet long, ending in a small square room. The walls were brick, but portions had crumbled, revealing older stone beneath. A plaque, unreadable from age, was embedded near the back. But it wasn't the room that drew the eye. It was the machine in the center. No, larger than a child's bicycle. It was a strange latticework of copper coils, wooden braces, and cracked glass tubes. Wires looped like ivy through its structure, leading to a small iron platform, almost like a stage. At its heart, a central tuning fork, etched with runes. Miss Marple took one slow breath. "This is what he hid," she said softly. Crisp nodded. "Some kind of resonator. The technicians say it's designed to amplify a very specific frequency. Ultrasonic. The kind that can induce nausea, dizziness, even fainting. A weapon built with church bells in mind," she murmured. "Or cloaked by them. Marchford built it when he was 16, Crisp said. According to recovered notes, he was trying to mimic the resonances of cathedral acoustics. He thought he could speak through sound. Said it was spiritual, scientific, revolutionary." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a line. "And what he made was a trap." Crisp knelt beside the frame, pointing to one corner. "See this? A recent addition. This wire links to a remote trigger hidden behind the 5th bell rope. Pull the rope, set off the device. If you're close enough, it becomes deadly." Crisp stood again. This wasn't just about recovery. It was about proving he was right. About showing the world he was more than a disgraced academic. Miss Marple looked around the chamber. The dust, the darkness, the long-buried secret. And what now? She asked. What becomes of it? We'll dismantle it, Crisp said. Safely. The ministry's sending a team. Nothing like it. Exists in the records. Too dangerous to preserve. She nodded Dot, then turned and walked once more through the passage. Lantern held high Dot. As she reached the stair, she paused Dot on the wall beside her. Half covered in soot was a faded message scratched. In chalk, no voice is silent if the stone remembers. She stared at it for a long time, then extinguished the lantern Dot above. The morning bells began to ring. Chapter 16. The man in the photograph back at Primrose Cottage. The fire crackled low as Miss Marple sat in her chair, a shawl across her lap, and the case files spread before her. She had promised herself a quiet day, perhaps a walk to the green, or a visit to the rose and thistle tea room. But something lingered, an itch of unfinished understanding. She turned once again to the photograph of Arthur Weatherby, taken just months before his death, the same one used at his memorial. She had seen it many times now, Arthur in his garden, watering can in hand, a crooked smile and a familiar cap on his head. But this morning, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. The background. A church window, but not tea. Seds, different stonework, broader glass. A different angle of sunlight than Elmsworth ever allowed Dot. She reached for a magnifying lens. There, reflected, faintly in the window's curve, was a second man, partly obscured, holding something. Us-A-T-C-H-E-L Dot, not Marchford. Taller, heavier, slight stoop to the shoulders. She stood and moved to her writing desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a small bundle of letters correspondence from her friend Colonel Weston, a former intelligence man with a sharp eye for detail. Among them was an envelope marked Private Marchford Inquiry. Inside, a photograph of a man taken outside the Royal Acoustic Society in London 3 years prior. He stood beside Marchford. Same build, same stoop, same SATCHEL. Rupert Kittredge, former sound engineer, known associate, and co-developer of Marchford's early experiments. Long vanished from the public eye after the scandal. Miss Marple exhaled. Marchford hadn't returned to Elmsworth alone. She rang for Inspector Crisp at once. When he arrived, she placed the photograph before him. He was here, she said. I believe he's still here. Crisp scanned the image. Kittredge? That's impossible. He was never mentioned in the statements. No, because Marchford wanted the focus on himself. But look at the reflection, Weatherby. New. That picture was taken the day before the murder. Crisp stiffened. Then you think it was Kittredge who set the trap? I think Marchford designed it. Kittredge deployed it. But why? Because Marchford was desperate. Kittredge was obsessed. Crisp grabbed his coat. We need to find him. Miss Marple stood slowly. We need to listen for him. The inspector turned, puzzled. Listen? She nodded, eyes distant. Because if Rupert Kittredge is hiding in Elmsworth, he'll go back to the one thing he can't resist. She stepped toward the window and looked out across the churchyard. The sound. Chapter 17. The return note by the following morning. St. Sed's was under quiet surveillance. No formal police presence, no barricades, no visible signs of alarm, just a subtle watchfulness, engineered by Inspector Crisp, and agreed upon by Miss Marple. If Rupert Kittredge was still in Elmsworth, he would not be frightened into hiding. He would be drawn out. The bait? A simple notice tacked to the church doors. Memorial bell peal for Arthur Weatherby. Full tower sequence restored. Sunday at midnight. An unusual time. An unusual sequence? And one known only to a few. Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately. because she had learned something else about Kittredge from Colonel Weston's files. He was tone-sensitive to a dangerous degree, obsessive, a man who believed sound could reveal the voice of God, or perhaps his own version of it. A man who couldn't resist hearing what wasn't meant for ears. And sure enough, late that evening, just before 10, the church received a letter. No stamp, slipped under the vestry door. Crisp brought it straight to Miss Marple. The handwriting was meticulous, slightly italicized. Confident dot, she unfolded it. To whom it may concern, if you ring the bells again, it will not be me who answers. You've already heard what sound can do, yet you insist on unmaking what was built to transcend you. Marchford was weak. He doubted, but I do not. I made it perfect. And if you desecrate the frequencies again, you'll see what perfection becomes when provoked. R.K. Crisp whistled. So it's a threat. It's a warning, Miss Marple corrected, from a man who believes he's a prophet. Crisp ran a hand through his hair. Do we call off the midnight bells? No, she said softly. We let them ring. The inspector looked startled. But if he's telling the truth, he wants us to be afraid, to remain silent. That's how he wins. Crisp glanced at the clock. 2 hours to midnight. Miss Marple stood and buttoned her coat. Then we'll need to be in position, not just to stop him, but to hear him coming. That night, under a rising moon and the watch of old saints carved in weathered stone, Elmsworth held its breath. The bells were ready. The trap had been reversed. And in the cold stillness of St. Sed's, Miss Marple waited, because some villains don't run when cornered. They echo back. Chapter 18. Midnight frequencies. The bell ropes hung still in. The tower, each one dusted and tested, rigged with sensors this time, not traps. Inspector Crisp stood just inside the side entrance with 2 constables, lanterns extinguished, eyes on the nave. Miss Marple sat alone in the 3rd pew, her hands folded, her ears listening not to footsteps, but to frequencies. The clock neared midnight. Above them, the bell ringers Thomas Bell and his trusted team stood ready to begin the memorial sequence. This time, they would ring in reverse order, starting with the silent 5th rope. It was a signal known now only to the few who mattered. Then it began. 5th bell, a clear, aching note. Then the 4th, the 3rd, the 2nd, the 1st. The chimes spread like ripples through the village, clean and heavy with memory dot, and beneath the sound, something stirred, a faint hum, barely perceptible. Miss Marple's eyes snapped to the northern TRANSEP, T dot there, dot, a shadow moving along the stone edge. Just beyond the candlelight, dot Inspector Crisp signaled the constables. But Miss Marple raised a hand. Wait, she mouthed, dot the man emerged from the dark. Tall, gray-coated figure with sharp shoulders and an odd tilt to his head, as though forever listening to something others could not hear. Rupert Kittredge. He didn't blink at the officers. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply stood beneath the bell tower, eyes closed, lips parted as if in rapture. They're perfect, he whispered. They're finally aligned. Miss Marple stepped forward. You knew he'd fail, she said quietly. Marchford. That's why you came back without him, to finish it yourself. Kittredge opened his eyes. They were pale blue and oddly empty. He forgot what it meant to feel sound, he murmured. But I remembered. The chamber wasn't just an amplifier, it was a tuner. And now, with the 5th bell restored, his hand slid into his coat. Stop. Crisp barked, gun raised. Kittredge's fingers paused, but didn't retreat. You know what lives beneath your church? He asked softly. Do you know what your ancestors buried under its floor? The tones they feared? I found them. Marchford just built the key. You mean the machine, Miss Marple said. The one you reactivated. Yes, Kittredge smiled faintly. And now, He reached. 2 shots rang out. Kittredge staggered not from Crisp, but from behind. A constable had fired from the choir loft above, striking him cleanly in the shoulder. He crumpled without a sound. The bell rope swayed gently. The 5th one, just for a moment, glowed with tension, vibrating unnaturally. Then, stilled, Crisp was already on him, retrieving the device from his coat, a small frequency trigger, patched together from copper and wire, designed to activate the underground chamber again. "You are going to turn the whole church into a speaker," he muttered, stunned. "God help us." Miss Marple knelt beside Kittredge as the paramedics were called. He smiled up at her through clenched teeth. "You don't understand sound," he said. "You only hear it." Miss Marple leaned in, her voice soft and absolute. "No, Mr. Kittredge, but I understand people. And that's what makes your echoes powerless in the end." Chapter 19. Echoes on the Green, and next morning dawned. Pale and damp. Mist curled across Elmsworth Green, and dew clung to hedges like tiny chandeliers. The church bells did not ring that day by choice. After everything, silence now felt like respect. Rupert Kittredge was in custody, recovering from his gunshot wound under heavy guard at St. Aldhelm's Hospital. The machine, the resonator, had been fully dismantled overnight by the ministry's special unit. They removed every wire, every coil, every scrap of tuning metal. Even the chalk writing beneath the church was carefully photographed, then washed away. Elmsworth had, once again, buried a secret, but not Miss Marple. She walked slowly across the green that morning, wrapped in her gray coat, her steps deliberate. Near the post office, she saw Thomas Bell, removing the memorial placard from the village notice board. "They'll be talking about this for years," he said. "Let them," she replied. "Better that they remember the danger than pretend it." "Never happened." He hesitated. "Do you think it's really over?" She paused. "Yes, but echoes can be stubborn, especially the kind built on obsession." At the Rose and Thistle tea room, a small crowd had already gathered. People needed comfort, warmth, and stories. Miss Marple declined tea for once. Instead, she stepped inside the little bookshop next door, Goddard's Antiquarian Books, rarely. Open on weekdays. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wood glue, and old pages. She moved quietly between the shelves and selected a thin volume from the reference section, A History of Sacred Harmonics in Southern England. She turned to a section marked with a familiar name, Kittredge Rupert. A footnote mentioned his work at Harrogate Cathedral, and one specific experiment abandoned after mysterious results. She ran her fingers beneath the passage. The cathedral bells were once tuned to produce a low, harmonic hum across the nave, known to stir disorientation in sensitive listeners. Kittredge theorized this frequency, when sustained, could induce altered states. The experiment was discontinued following illness among parishioners. She closed the book. So it had begun long before Elmsworth, and yet it was here that the idea had nearly succeeded. That evening, back at Primrose Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, writing the final entry in her notebook. She wrote not of murder or machines, but of loneliness, and how it echoes louder than any bell if left unattended. Because, in the end, that was the thread that tied them all: Marchford, Weatherby, Kittredge, even poor Eleanor Fletcher. They had all tried to fill a silence inside them. Some with love, others with control, one with sound. She paused, then added, "Even the most dangerous ideas begin as quiet thoughts. And sometimes it takes a village to listen before it's too late." Outside, night fell, and for the first time in many nights, the wind carried no hum, no static, no trembling vibration. Just peace. Chapter 20. The final ring. 2 weeks had passed, and the village of Elmsworth had begun to breathe again. The headlines faded. The ministry left. The church was reopened, and the bells, those storied, nearly weaponized bells, were finally silent by choice, just for now. As if they too needed rest. Miss Marple, however, had not rested. She had spent her days tidying, not just her garden or sitting room, but her thoughts, clearing away the finer webs of the case. Not the major players, Marchford, Kittredge, Eleanor Fletcher, but the smaller questions. Why did Weatherby know? Why did he photograph that second man? And why, with all his quiet life, did he make such a dangerous enemy? That answer came unexpectedly in the form of a parcel, hand-delivered by the vicar himself. Found this tucked away in a drawer in the vestry, Reverend Hall explained. Weatherby must have left it for someone. Your name was penciled on the inside cover. Miss Marple opened the brown paper wrapping slowly. Inside, a leather-bound notebook, old but carefully preserved. On the front page, in faded ink, Arthur. Weatherby, bell logs and observations, St. Sed's Church. She turned the pages gently. Line after line, he had recorded bell sequences, mechanical adjustments, and curious irregularities in tone. But deeper in the book, the entries grew stranger. The 12th of February rope 5 sounds subtly altered, not due to weather. A pulse behind the tone? The 18th of March tuned hum again. Matches Kittredge notes from 1938 article. Disturbing. The 2nd of April, saw a man near vestry. Matches old photo of Kay, don't trust Lyle. Must act soon. Miss Marple leaned back, the firelight catching the corners of her glasses. Arthur hadn't stumbled into the truth. He'd uncovered it deliberately. With quiet persistence. He'd tracked the reactivation of a weapon buried beneath his church. And when he realized who Lyle truly was, Marchford, he confronted him. He knew it might cost him everything. And it had. That Sunday, Miss Marple attended church not for service, but for a moment of sound. As the final hymn faded and the congregation left, she stood alone at the bottom of the bell tower. She placed her hand on the 5th rope. And gave it one soft pull. The bell rang low and clean, but not deadly, not distorted, just a bell. No more secrets in its echo. And then she walked home.